This podcast features criminologists discussing sensitive themes and topics. Listener discretion is advised. A passionate love triangle leads to the murder of an innocent 22-year-old man. But in this case, nothing is what it seems. This is the Mary Shieler story. Hello, Amy.
Hi, I'm not surprised you're doing a love triangle today, huh?
You have pointed this out a couple of times. I do tend to get involved in love triangle cases. Yes. Okay, that's a fair point, but you'll see why I chose this one. And I just want you to know it's not because of the love triangle angle. This case has been on my list from day one. I'm not kidding. I've referenced it before, by the way. So I'll be interested to see if you remember anything about this one, or if anyone else remembers me referencing it in another episode. I don't want to give too much away, though, but it, yes, does involve a forbidden internet romance that had devastating consequences for some, but not all people involved.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's a really good example, too, just so you know before we get to it, of showing what happens when the law has not yet caught up with technology. There is also a documentary for this case, which I will reference at the end of today's episode for those interested. And there's a Lifetime movie, of course. Amy, I don't know if you know this. I know you know that I was addicted to crime television, but did you know that I used to have a Lifetime Movie Network edition as well?
I don't think I knew that, but I could have guessed it.
Oh, no. I've since moved on from that, just so you know. But yes, I did used to watch all of these Lifetime movies as well with my mom, of course, and on my own. And I swear I even got my dad, when he was alive, involved in one or two as well. For today's episode, just so you know, I'm shaking it up a little. So I'm going to tell the story a little bit differently than the way I normally do, where we start with the subject's early life. But you'll see the way I'm telling it makes more sense in unraveling the details of this very complicated case. So before we meet the namesake of today's case, we first have to get into the internet romance between TallHotBlonde and Marine Sniper.
I'm assuming those are screen names?
I hope so. All right. In May of 2005 in Buffalo, New York, 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery was going through a bit of a midlife crisis. He was a recovering alcoholic who was married to his wife, Cindy, and they had two teenage daughters at the time. Thomas worked as a machinist at the Dynabride Corporation, which was not his dream job, but it allowed him to provide for his family. Thomas's friends and neighbors said that he was one of the best neighbors in the neighborhood, always willing to help people out, nice in general. Their only real complaint about Thomas Montgomery was that he was a little bit awkward, a little socially awkward, maybe a little quieter. But other than that, for all intents and purposes, the Montgomerys seemed like a normal, quote, we should say, quote, normal, middle-class family. His daughters meant the world to him, and they loved their father. He did everything for them, and there was reportedly a very close relationship. However, around 2005, Thomas and Cindy began having issues in their relationship. And a lot of them revolved around their sex life at the time. It appeared that Thomas wasn't able to perform, and it was putting a big strain on their relationship. Though it wasn't clear, I don't know if he was suffering from erectile dysfunction or there were other issues going on mentally. I don't know if it was involved in the marriage. So I just want to make sure to say that now. Regardless, due to this frustration, I think, Thomas began to fill his free time with other things, and he found the website Pogo. Have you ever heard of Pogo?
Absolutely not, no. And this is what, 2005 you said?
Yes, so kind of early. Mm-hmm. I hadn't either, but Pogo is a gaming website where you can play games like poker, blackjack. You can enter chat rooms with fellow players and contestants, so it's almost social, but it's definitely for game players as well. Mm-hmm. Well, one day while he was on this site, Thomas got a message from someone with the screen name TallHotBlonde.
Jeez. Okay.
Hence the name, right? Mm-hmm. It ended up being a girl who told Thomas that her name was Jessie and that she was a high school senior from West Virginia, age 18.
Okay.
Thomas, being a little bored with his life and intrigued by the messages, which were initiated by Jesse, responded to her. And the two began conversing over Pogo. Because remember, I said you could also do chats.
Wait, I'm sorry, Meghan. Did he let her know how old he was?
So you read
Sorry.
my mind, Amy. So no, that's okay. It's a great question. Instead of revealing his true identity, name, and age, Thomas decided to say that his name was Tommy and that he was also 18 years old and a Marine following his screen name, Marine Sniper. So this is quite the lie, the ruse here.
And who knows if Jesse's who she says either.
I mean, that's a fair point as well.
Mm-hmm.
Despite Thomas's lie about his identity and the seemingly very large age difference between a 46-year-old and the 18-year-old, their conversations continued and they got flirtier and flirtier. The first photo that Jessie sent to Thomas was of her in a bathing suit. She said that she was a softball player and a basketball player. So she sent multiple photos of herself in these uniforms as well. So I guess maybe Thomas did consider the fact that maybe Jessie wasn't real or who she said she was, but she did consistently send photos that were in line with exactly what she said she was and what she was doing. At the time, he believed in the legitimacy of Jessie, let's just say.
How did he send photos to her?
He sent younger photos of himself. There are we're going to talk at times, there were other kinds of racy videos and texts and things like that. So I'm not sure how he pulled off all of those. But, he was using younger photos of himself. He was, in fact, a Marine at one point. So he had like the uniform and he had a lot of stuff that was fitting with his story.
But Meghan, if you asked me to send you pictures of me when I was 18, you'd be able to tell they were from a long time ago based on the camera, based on what you're wearing. So it's interesting that Jessie didn't question this. Or then again, is Jessie really Jessie? Who knows?
I did see some of the photos, not all of them, but like a couple of them were just him in his uniform in a photo.
Gotcha.
Now the Marine uniform hasn't changed all that much and they have short hair. So there are some that
That's
I
true.
could say I would look at them and I wouldn't have questioned the time period, maybe like the grainy photos and whatnot, but I think that's a fair point. I don't know how he pulled it off so much. Also, maybe an 18-year-old isn't paying quite as much attention as, a sharp 40-something like yourself would be. But at the time, it worked. And the more the two chatted, the more revealing and the sexier the photos from Jessie became, primarily the photos from her. He also sent, like I said, his own photos of himself. But he didn't send as many, and he told Jessie that he was getting ready to go on secret missions and that he was at boot camp when he wasn't, when he clearly was not. But I think he had good excuses at times for why maybe he couldn't send photos that she would have wanted at the time. You know what I mean? As a side note, Amy, I just want to say that it was revealed that Thomas Montgomery was a Marine, but he was not a sniper, and it seemed that he most likely never even saw any type of field action. Even though, again, this Marine sniper was a huge part of his online identity that he was portraying to Jessie. He told Jessie that he was 6 feet tall with reddish brown hair, very muscular. And, some of this was true, but I will say some of it was exaggerated, although I don't think there's much harm in exaggerating a little bit of your physical appearance online. Some people do, I'm 5'10" when I'm 5'9", weigh a few pounds less. So this part isn't necessarily so out of line with what people do. But in addition to lying about his looks and his job, Thomas fabricated other profiles of people in Tommy's life to talk to Jessie and to support the idea that he was telling the truth about who he was.
Is that because Jessie was questioning who he was? Or why is he doing that?
Interestingly, I didn't see any part of her questioning it. Although that doesn't mean that she did not. And he also must have felt insecure about the fact that he was lying and sending older photos. But I think also she did ask for things like photos that he said he couldn't send at a time because he was in boot camp or training. So I think he felt like he had to bolster that excuse.
Gotcha. Are they geographically anywhere near each other, these two?
I forget their exact geography right now. It's escaping me. A meetup is definitely a possibility, although it would have been, a few-hour drive, that kind of thing. So they're not so close that they're going to bump into each other. In fact, just so you know, in one of his profiles, he pretended to be his own Tommy's father to keep up this appearance, again, that he was in boot camp. So Jessie would message with Tommy's father and ask him to relay certain messages to Tommy when she couldn't message him at boot camp. This was also because Thomas Montgomery has a family and he can't be available to Jessie at all times. Unbeknownst to Jesse at the time, she was just messaging Thomas. Thomas is Tommy. Tommy, is his own father. It's all the same person. As time went on, Thomas Montgomery got more and more nervous, though, about this online affair. Things were getting a little serious, and Thomas was growing afraid that his wife would find out. At one point, posing as his father, he told Jesse that he just couldn't message, or she wasn't allowed to message with Tommy anymore, probably in relation to some of his marine activities, and that he just didn't have time right now. It seemed, though, that each time he tried to end things, Jesse would push a little bit, convince him to keep talking to her, and not that it was her fault at all, but Thomas didn't seem to have the willpower to walk away. It seemed like he made small attempts, but when push came to shove, he really didn't want to walk away from Jesse.
Did Jesse ever suggest that they meet up, or is that not even on the table here?
Not yet.
Okay.
The relationship between Jesse and Tommy did escalate, though. It was kind of going in stages. To the point, at first they were texting, then they were sending photos, and at this point they were sending each other gifts, and they were talking on the phone when Thomas was, quote, off duty.
I would think you would notice a pretty big voice difference between an 18-year-old and a 40-something. Do you disagree?
I don't know. It depends on the voice, to be honest. Like, I definitely know men who have had deep voices since they were probably, 18, 19, 20 years old.
I just feel like there's something about talking to someone where you would be able to discern that big of an age gap, whether it be mannerisms or anything.
I'd like to think that I could and you could, but I'm not sure, again, that everyone could, or age differences. Yeah. But perhaps he also sounded younger than he was. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of factors. He also might have been like muffled, or I have to whisper, so many things.
Do you think he Googled cool teenage terms so he knew what to say?
Probably. Seriously.
That's lit. Or whatever teenagers would say.
That's great. I haven't heard that in a long time, but that's great. During these conversations, too, they were engaging in phone sex and, other types of sexual activity, like virtual sex through the chat rooms. But they also had this component of their relationship where they exchanged I love yous. Thomas knew that this relationship was escalating, and it was going to be hard to keep continuing with all these lies, but he became so invested in Jesse and in this new identity that he saw. In fact, a later investigation showed that Thomas had written a note, and his note said, on January 2nd, 2006, Tom Montgomery, 46 years old, ceases to exist and is replaced by an 18-year-old battle-scarred Marine. He is moving to West Virginia to be with the love of his life. And the note even mentioned that Tommy is able to perform sexually more than Thomas Montgomery. He was also quoted as saying that the relationship was more real to him than life itself.
Who's this note to? Just like a note to self?
I think it was a note to self, yeah. It definitely demonstrated that he might have been getting just a little too immersed in this relationship and losing his sense of reality.
I was just going to say, sounds like a break in reality a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. Unfortunately for Thomas, a few months later, one of his daughters ended up discovering his online relationship. So at the time, she had asked to borrow her father's computer. And while she was using it, a message from TallHotBlonde popped up in the screen.
Oh, boy.
Now, the daughter actually went to her mother, Cindy, and told her about what she found. And an upset, as you can understand, Cindy began investigating what her husband was doing. And she found love letters Thomas and Jesse had been sending back and forth, along with lingerie that Thomas was going to give to Jesse, and a lot of their online messages. She also found provocative photos that they were sending back and forth between the two, and she found out that Thomas had lied to this teenage girl about his identity.
Oh boy. So I'm assuming she's going to confront him with this, or is she going to keep quiet and just gather?
Actually, she wasn't having it. After she discovered this affair, she did confront him, but she also wrote a letter to Jesse's address to blow the lid off Thomas's deceptions. Inside the letter, Amy, she included a family photo of her and Thomas and their two daughters.
Wow.
She wrote to Jesse that there was no Tommy and that the man she was talking to was a 47-year-old married man with a family. Whoa.
Wow.
When Jesse received the letter in the mail, she messaged Tommy immediately, telling him that she hated him and that he should be in jail for what he did to her, being an old man and her being an 18-year-old girl.
Although it's not illegal by the court of law. It's icky, but it's not illegal.
That's correct. But Jessie went one step further in reaction to what she found out. She reached out to one of Tommy's coworkers, Brian Barrett, to find out if Tommy had really lied to such an extreme extent, or if this was not some woman, also angry woman sending something. Was this the full truth? That's what she wanted to know.
And this was one of Thomas's colleagues or Tommy's?
Well, they're one and the same. It's one of Thomas's colleagues, and it should be noted that a lot of his colleagues played Pogo online. So this was online contact that she made.
Gotcha.
So why Brian Barrett? Who is he? Well, Brian, at 22 years old, was also a part-time machinist at the Dynabride plant where Thomas worked. Or Tommy. Again, one and the same.
But I'm sorry, but what my question is more so, did Thomas tell Jessie his real place of employment? That's how she got connected?
I believe she knew that, yes.
Okay.
And if she didn't, then Cindy definitely did in her letter.
Got it.
She absolutely knew who his colleagues were, and I think she had some contacts, again, email contacts with them. And also it was because I think some of the players that they were playing with, Jessie knew were his colleagues.
Got it.
So Brian Barrett was the oldest in his family and was going to college at Buffalo State University to become a teacher. He lived in the small town of Lockport, New York, and everybody reportedly liked Brian a lot. He coached Little League and he coached soccer with his dad. All of his coaches and teachers described him as very loyal, easygoing, always willing to help someone out. Now, as I said, he met Jessie through Thomas because they played online games together on the Pogo website. But he and Thomas weren't friends. They were colleagues. They had a huge age difference and very different lives. When Brian heard from Jessie online, he was shocked to learn that his coworker was having an online relationship with an 18-year-old girl. And he was even more shocked to find out that Thomas had lied about his identity to pursue her. Though they weren't friends, he knew Thomas, and most people knew Thomas as a kind of nice stand-up guy, so this information was kind of explosive. Brian pretty much confirmed what Cindy had told Jessie about Thomas, that he was a married man in his 40s with children. But it didn't stop there. Brian kind of stepped in and began to comfort Jessie through their chats, apologizing for what Thomas had done and offering her a friendly shoulder, even though not a real shoulder.
I see where this is going now. Because you did say triangle early on. I was wondering who the third peg was here.
I did say that. Through their chats, Brian and Jessie realized that, they were close in age and they had a lot in common. So they began kind of a flirtatious relationship, and eventually a new budding romance formed between Jessie and Brian. Brian was who he said he was.
Okay.
Now, Jessie messaged Thomas, telling him that she'd moved on to someone better than him and that he should leave her alone. She was still quite angry.
He was still trying to pursue her, even after this all blew up?
Yes, he was apologizing and trying to explain why he did what he did, just falling for her.
Did Cindy leave Thomas, or they're still together?
I believe they kind of separated in the house. They weren't like actively staying in the same room or whatnot, but they did not separate outside of the home. Brian told people at his workplace, though, about this new relationship with Jessie. He was excited about it. And unfortunately, he also publicly revealed that Thomas Montgomery had catfished an 18-year-old girl into an online relationship, which did not work out well for Thomas at work. He was receiving, hate from his coworkers, his family, and even online, as other Pogo players were aware of what Thomas had done. Because of this backlash, Thomas's Pogo account was actually suspended for a short time, which made him very angry.
This is, Meghan, might I add, this is informal sanctioning at its finest, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And we say sometimes that's worse, right?
Yeah. It sounds like in this case, this is going to be really damaging to Thomas.
Yes, it was. And you know what else, Amy? Here, even though Jessie knew the truth about Thomas's identity and was angry with him, she also wasn't quite ready to let go of her relationship with him. So Jessie, on one hand, was telling people that Thomas was creepy and, she maybe even dangerous. But on the other hand, she was still messaging with him that even though she was angry with him and she hated him, she missed what she and Tommy had.
Okay.
So, prompted by Jessie's forgiving messages, Thomas and Jessie decided to start over as friends.
You don't need an 18-year-old friend if you're a 40-something-year-old man.
You certainly do not. And talking as friends went on for a little bit, but then, it led to a romantic connection again. And Jessie stating that even though Thomas had deceived her and he was 47 years old, she still wanted him back. And I mean, Thomas was all too ready to jump back in with Jessie. Apparently, they got back into sexually explicit messages. But, just as Thomas believed the second round of his relationship or second phase was going well, Jessie messaged him again saying that she was sorry, but she made a mistake, that she couldn't do it, and that she actually wanted to be with Brian. And so she was not going to message Thomas anymore. Now, Thomas was livid, and he directed this rage towards Brian Barrett for stealing his girlfriend. He was also angry, reportedly. This is, kind of a gross part, but he thought that Jessie was a virgin. So the fact that Brian was going to be Jessie's first instead of him, which he and Jessie had planned for so long, really sparked, I think, a thirst for revenge in Thomas. He started threatening and harassing Jessie online, calling her all kinds of derogatory names and saying that he hoped she was a victim of a violent act. Thomas also sent Jessie violent messages about Brian, saying that Brian was going to pay in blood for this betrayal. He even claimed that he almost shot Brian at work the day after Jessie messaged him that she wanted to be with Brian. Now, we have no reports to confirm whether or not he actually did such a thing, but this is what he indicated in his messages. That's how angry he was. So Jessie did what anyone would do in that situation. She warned Brian that he might be in danger and that she thought he should really stay away from Thomas. And it seemed that Thomas had begun doing violent things, as Brian told Jessie that he thought Thomas had actually tried to hit him with his car in their workplace in the parking lot.
Did Brian or Jessie think to get the police involved, try to get a restraining order?
If they thought it, they didn't act on it. Let's put it that way. It was a question I had as well, but they didn't do anything outside of it. They weren't quite sure. They didn't know if it was talk. But I'm sure it was leading up to that, or I would think it was leading up to that. And the fact is that Brian really cared for Jessie, and they had planned a meeting in person. Like, this was going to be a real relationship, according to the both of them. And so Brian was willing to take the chance. He told Jessie that, he understood Thomas might be dangerous and that he would have to be careful, but that she was very important to him, and he wanted to see her and he wanted to meet her. And so they made plans to meet the weekend of September 16th of 2006. So again, he promised Jessie that he'd be careful, but that would prove a difficult promise to keep. On Friday, September 15th at 10 p.m., the night before he was supposed to drive from Buffalo to West Virginia to meet Jessie, Brian left work and got into his new truck. But he'd never even turned it on. He was shot 3 times while in his truck, and he died instantly.
Wow.
Yeah, right? I mean, the worst part was that Jessie had to cancel on Brian at the very last minute, so his close friends and family were under the impression that Brian was out of town all weekend. Nobody realized that he was missing until Monday morning when his coworkers found him dead in his car in the parking lot.
Oh, wow. I think it's very clear who the suspect is, right?
Well, I was going to say his coworkers found him, but there was one coworker that did not show up to work that day, and that was Thomas Montgomery. Sorry, I'd also like to point out, you had asked a question earlier about geography, so we were talking about New York to West Virginia. James and I drove it, and I'm trying to remember how far it actually was. I want to say it was about 6 or 7 hours maybe when we drove it, so again, this is not close geography, but it's not beyond a car drive or meeting in the middle. So at the scene on Monday, the police were called in and they found that Brian's back tire had been slashed in his car, likely to prevent him from driving away from his assailant. They also discovered a peach pit and shell casings. So there's some evidence around the car and in the car. Police interviewed Brian's coworkers, and all of them told the police about the love triangle between Brian, Jessie, and Thomas, as this was very common knowledge where they worked. So the investigators tried to locate Thomas Montgomery, but then when they couldn't find him immediately, they feared for Jessie's safety. And so they went about locating her first. They had someone who was already deceased, and they have an angry man, and he's not at home and he's not at work. So sending police officers to Jessie's home was the concern. And they had enough information about Jessie, where she lived, what kind of organization she was involved in. So they began to look for her through MySpace, and she wasn't that hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
They quickly found her address and sent out police in West Virginia to check on Jessie. When they got to Jessie's home, another woman answered the door, a woman in her 40s named Mary Shieler. Now, the police asked for Jessie, and Mary informed them that Jessie was her 18-year-old daughter and wanted to know what was going on.
Oh, okay. I actually thought Jessie was not going to be who she said. That's what I've been waiting on the edge of my seat for.
I know you have.
Okay.
And since Mary said that Jessie was not at home, they explained the situation about her daughter was involved in a love triangle that had just led to the murder of a 22-year-old young man in New York. Mm-hmm. They said his murderer was on the run and that they were worried for her daughter's safety. When the police asked if there was a way she could get in contact with Jessie, Mary said no, which didn't make sense to the police. This is her daughter and she lives there.
Yeah.
So they continued to question Mary about her daughter, Jessie, and suddenly Mary broke down crying. She said that she needed to tell them something.
Oh, I was right, maybe. What a roller coaster. Oh, gosh. Is Mary Jessie?
You see, Mary had been the one behind the TallHotBlonde profile.
Oh, my goodness.
She had been posing as her 18-year-old daughter, Jessie, and sending the messages to both Thomas Montgomery and Brian Barrett.
Oh, so Jessie is a real person, and this woman was posing as her daughter?
That's correct.
Wow.
Bombshell, right?
Yeah.
She had been using her daughter's photos, using her profile, using everything to fake being her daughter. And Mary, who had never been in trouble with the law, also told the police that she had gotten a call from Thomas Montgomery shortly after Brian's murder, and he said, "Your boyfriend was very easy to take care of," which only further confirmed suspicions of the police. So, Thomas Montgomery was located later that day and arrested for suspicion on first-degree murder. He was later charged with the crime in November. Thomas denied everything, claiming that he'd been at home with his wife and daughters on the night of the murder and that they would vouch for him. But guess what? Thomas was sorely mistaken. Cindy and his girls did not back up his story. They told the police the truth, that he was not at home that evening. And Cindy pretty quickly, just so you know, filed for divorce from Thomas while he was in jail awaiting trial. Mm-hmm. I know you're curious about Mary, and we will get back to her.
I have many questions, but I'm trying to wait.
Know. Yes, I know. I can see it on your face. The investigation, to no one's surprise, revealed very strong evidence of Thomas's guilt. The DNA on the peach pit left at the scene was a match for Thomas Montgomery. They had the threats that Thomas had made in his messages. They had information from Mary Shieler. They had information from one of Thomas's coworkers who told the police that if he was ever to murder someone, he would use an old military gun. So it was no surprise when investigators found that Thomas's gun was missing from his cabinet, and guess what? It matched the .30 caliber shells used to kill Brian Barrett.
Sounds like an open and closed case.
Yes, needless to say, it was. But what about Jessie? Well, Thomas never doubted that he was dating an 18-year-old girl until he was in custody, and the police showed him a picture of 45-year-old Mary Shieler and told him that that was the real Jessie. Can you imagine his shock?
And he can't be mad. He was doing the same thing. It's so interesting that these two were talking. They were both pretty much the same age, and they were both posing as these teenagers or young adults. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, this is a situation where the catfisher becomes the catfished as well.
Unbelievable.
Yes, he was shocked, seemingly despondent, and while in custody, Thomas attempted to take his life multiple times. They put him on suicide watch.
I mean, this man threw away his whole life for something that wasn't even real.
That's correct. His trial was set for 2009, which was 3 years after Brian's murder, and with all the strong evidence against him, Thomas decided it would be in everyone's best interest if he took a plea deal.
Yeah.
But right before the sentencing hearing was to take place, he tried to withdraw his plea, which we've seen happen before. Change of heart, realizing the sentence, which I'll get to, but his motion was denied and the plea went forward. At his sentencing hearing, Brian's family spoke. Brian's father said the following: "My wife and I don't understand how this could happen to our family. We don't understand how such evil could exist in the world. To gun down a boy over simple jealousy just does not make sense. I'm sure they were shocked as well to learn of the whole convoluted story and that unfortunately their son was really truly the innocent pawn in this whole mess.
Yep.
Thomas Montgomery did wind up, as I said, pleading guilty to first-degree manslaughter. That was the reduced charge, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison plus 5 years of community supervision.
Mary, what does Mary get? Because
hold on, we're almost there. I would like to say this is first-degree premeditated murder. This would have been life in prison, 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, he pled to manslaughter, right?
Yes, but that's a good plea deal, I would think, for this.
I don't think it's necessarily appropriate, but it's good for him.
Right. In fact, if my math is terrible, but if it's correct, he's going to be up for parole in about 4 years. He's appealed his case many times, but his appeals have been denied.
Is he claiming he's innocent? What is he appealing on?
I don't know the nature of his appeals, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know what they focus on.
Maybe like ineffective assistance or who knows?
I would imagine so. I think that was part of it. I think his lawyer had been the one to kind of talk him into the plea deal, which I think a good lawyer in this case probably would do. Mm-hmm. And later on when he went to withdraw his appeal, I think it was about his lawyer's advice. So no, I don't think he was appealing his innocence. Okay, so the big question you asked is, what about Mary Shieler? What was her role? Was she charged with anything? Was she criminally responsible for her actions?
Yes.
Okay, so what would they charge her with?
I think she should be charged with... Okay, I don't know. It's your case, not mine.
Well, that's the tough question. Immediately, we both think you should be charged with fraud, right? Or... what's the illegal action tied to catfishing?
Yeah.
Well, the problem here is that catfishing is not technically a crime. And in 2009, it was barely on the radar as the serious act that we now recognize it as. Mm-hmm. So Mary Shieler was never charged with anything at all because technically she never committed a crime.
You know, I wonder if her daughter was 17, if she could be charged with endangering the welfare of a child.
So I thought about that as well, but I think her daughter was 18 at the time.
Please tell me, what did her daughter, is there any interviews or information about Jessie? She could have been murdered over this.
Oh my goodness. It's very shocking. Let me tell you, yes, there is some but limited information. I'll give you what I have. Mary has rarely spoken out herself, but when she has, she, in one interview, portrayed herself as a hero, Amy, get this, stating that she talked to Thomas and pursued a relationship with him so that he wouldn't go out and talk to underage children online and prey on them. She felt that she was doing some type of community service here.
That's absurd.
Yes. And also, it came to light that Mary took pictures of her daughter, Jessie, put flirtatious captions on them.
But she didn't take any explicit photos, did she?
You know what's interesting? I think she walked the line because I saw that she took ones of her in her bathing suit and a lot of these pictures were ones that Jessie had taken of herself that her mother stole. But there were some photos that she took that were just on that line. None of them were nude per se that I could find, which doesn't mean that doesn't exist. But I think she was kind of careful. But by the way, she had sent these photos to multiple online suitors to solicit them. So she wasn't worried about Thomas. She was putting it out there for many people, unless, again, she was patrolling the whole community for these types of possible online predators, as she would say. I don't think this was a hero situation.
I don't either.
I think a lot of people were shocked. Mary was a very ordinary person at the time. Again, no criminal history, and she seemingly had a close relationship with her daughter. I think that Jessie was, I couldn't find anything about other siblings. I got the impression Jessie was an only child, if not definitely the only daughter.
Was there a father in the picture?
Yes, yes, her parents, yes. So that's what I'm saying. From what I saw, it was Jessie and her mother and her father, and they were pretty close. Nobody would have suspected Mary Shieler of this type of behavior, and especially not of taking advantage of her younger daughter. Now, the real Jessie and her father had no idea what Mary was up to in her spare time on the computer when they were, sleeping, and this was late at night, I guess. They didn't know anything until Thomas Montgomery was arrested and convicted for the murder of Brian Barrett. Imagine their surprise, the shock, the horror. When he found out Mary's husband filed for divorce, and neither him nor Jessie have spoken to Mary since that we could find. They both publicly, that was the last public statement I saw, that they had divorced themselves from her. They were no longer in contact with her, and they would not be. So I don't know. It's been a long time since this case happened. Maybe they've made some type of amends, but I imagine it took a very long time if they did.
I would like to think that Mary, maybe it started out like she was going to just kidding around, or maybe it just like got so far out of control. I don't know that she ever actually thought she was endangering the life of her child.
No.
What she did was uncalled for and despicable, really. But I can't imagine that she realized it could escalate to the place it did.
So were there foreseeable consequences?
Here we go again, right? I've been thinking that
recent
the whole
episode.
Time.
Another comment that Mary had made, again, only a few public comments. She said to the BBC, she denounced her actions in Brian's death, but she, I thought, minimized it, saying that it was stupid, it should not have happened. She expressed her interest in writing a book about the dangers of the internet, seemingly placing the blame outside of herself.
Oh, come on.
So, it sounded like she minimally took responsibility, but not fully. As for Thomas, as I said, he's currently serving his 20-year sentence and will be eligible for parole in a couple of years. Brian Barrett's parents continue to mourn the loss of their son, and they have a petition to try and change the law. They're hoping that someone who does what Mary Shieler did could be held criminally responsible in some way. And as you know, they have an uphill battle with the crime of catfishing not being recognized yet by the law.
It's still not? I know at the time of this case it wasn't, but currently?
No, I'm going to discuss that a bit at the end, catfishing and where it stands. But now that we have the full story, let's discuss the causes of the crime and the behaviors that facilitated it. So one of the reasons I think you had said I always like love triangle cases, or maybe catfishing.
This is very different.
Catfishing cases. Yes, this one is different. But one of the things that fascinates me about criminology and about our jobs is exploring human behavior. And more so, I'm very fascinated by cases in which seemingly ordinary people wind up doing such extraordinary things. Where did that line, was it for them? How did they cross it? What separates them from most of us, I would think the majority of us, who maybe have these thoughts but don't act on them because we perceive the consequences of our actions? Explaining Thomas Montgomery's crime, although it's not really difficult to explain it. It's almost textbook midlife crisis, because it seems that he was he sought to deal with midlife boredom and fill a void outside of his marriage. But instead of dealing with these feelings, with himself or possible changes within his marriage, Montgomery sought outside interference to relieve internal strife, which I think we've seen often, or many cases of. Instead of dealing with the internal factors, people are looking for any type of kind of external pacification or, outlet. So I think he really wanted to have excitement in his life again, which is what a younger, adoring female brought to him. But this case went to the extreme, as you said, and Thomas became so immersed in this reality that was not reality, right? It was a fake life. But he couldn't cope with the idea that he was going to lose Jessie to Brian. I think it was through his obsession, and I also think that this came to be a real threat to his newfound masculinity. Remember, he said that Tommy could function, Tommy was a better man, but all of a sudden Brian is going to take away Tommy's success. In some ways, it's classic strain theory, that the very stressors of losing what he perceived as his new life caused this man to literally snap. What do you think, Amy, before move on? But what about Thomas?
Yeah, I think he definitely has. I think it was definitely the threat of him losing Jessie. So control balance, maybe a little bit there.
Okay.
The only other thing that comes up for me is I think he just had these traits of, general theory of crime, which talks about the traits of impulsivity and self-control.
Okay.
I think that was part of it as well. I don't know if there was any, something going on psychologically. It seems like there had to have been for what he did, but it might just be simply, rational choice theory where he saw this, he actually thought he'd get away with it. And, the cost benefit analysis for him was Jessie will be mine if this person is no longer here. And maybe he didn't even think about the consequences. I don't know how he thought he would get away with this.
Right. Yeah. This is where rational choice goes irrational, right? We're not all perfect actors.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting part about you're saying general theory of crime and impulsivity, low self-control is part of that. It does seem like he lost control, but in his life before that, he
Yeah.
did seem to possess self-control. And, he was a law-abiding,
Mm-hmm.
rule-abiding family man who didn't seem to act so much outside the bounds of what we
Yeah.
expect of people. So if there was a loss of self-control, it definitely happened as he became more and more invested and somewhat
Mm-hmm.
deluded in this relationship.
And also, we have to point out how rare it is for somebody to commit their first crime at his age.
Absolutely. So, so rare.
So rare for someone to be a law-abiding citizen and then all of a sudden in their late 40s murder someone. You don't see that very often.
No, we absolutely do not. You had asked about catfishing, so let's talk a little bit about catfishing here. First of all, the very act of catfishing is luring a victim online by pretending to be someone else, by creating a fake identity. Now, most catfishing is done for fraud purposes and dating scams, but also for violent crimes, and especially cases that we cover. More commonly for fraud and for dating scams.
Mm-hmm.
Those who become involved usually suffer from low self-esteem, extreme loneliness, and boredom. These are the ones not related to fraud. But there are also people who suffer from serious personality disorders who prey upon victims having no regard or sympathy for the pain they cause.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like fun and games. I think Mary and Thomas fall into the former category, having established a relationship as a way to gain attention from their seemingly bored lives that they were leading at the time, that they were finding less and less meaning in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that this problem, or the way they handled it, was exacerbated by the addictive nature of this type of engagement.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about this before in terms of internet predators. It's very easy to predate on people online because you're hidden.
Mm-hmm.
There's no face, right? So in this case, their behaviors were hidden. Their identities were kind of hidden. There was no promises of having to meet in person for a long time. So the addiction is also rooted in this classic dopamine response one feels in the rewards of that constant messaging from their romantic online interest.
Mm-hmm.
We see this play out every day just in normal behavior, right? Our students can't help but text in class. They can't help but respond. There's a dopamine hit.
Yes, it also seems like the behavior is very low stakes. At least it seems like from the from the perspective of the person in it. Like he's still able to go on with his life, be married, have a job, and just text and message this person on the side. Probably not realizing how quickly these situations can escalate.
I don't think they realized until it escalated to where it did. And then I think for certain, Thomas did realize it, but he was so immersed.
Mm-hmm.
He was involved. He couldn't get out. He was addicted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that Mary became more addicted to attention as time went on as well. Now she didn't just have Thomas. She had two men who were wooing her successfully. And I think that she wanted more from both of them because I think it was the attention that Mary so desperately needed. The motives were while the motives were the same for Mary and Thomas, you might say, I also think what they got, the response and the rewards they got were somewhat different.
I always wonder in these situations, how do they expect it to end? Because it's going to escalate to a point where people want to meet in person. And it seems like it was going that way because Jesse and Brian it seemed like they were going to be meeting soon. So these catfishers think if this just goes away at some point, it just seems...
I don't think they foresee. I don't think they look ahead that far. I think it's one step at a time that this escalates. And I think there's always I can back out, I can always cancel like Jesse had canceled with Brian. I have a good excuse. I think they believe they can prolong the activity for a long time, but I don't really think they plan on the long-term consequences. It's because it's so instant rewarding. It's so dopamine related. I think it's just enjoy the moment and the rewards you get in that moment and no long-term planning.
It's shocking to me. Do you recall the name of the case that we did with Tyler from Minds of Madness? Because that case was another catfishing case that I'm not sure I've ever heard a more wild story. This is close, though.
I know which case you're talking about. Was the name?
Yeah.
Regardless, I know we did another case like this. I also, I had said that I mentioned this in a case that I'd covered earlier. I think it was episode 40 or in the 40s, Janelle Potter. She had catfished her own
yes.
family, catfished
Yes.
a boyfriend. Very, very complicated. And also, I recently listened to a podcast called Sweet Bobby, and this is...
I knew you were going to say that. I haven't listened, but you told me about it. I've heard it's wild. It's a catfishing story.
It blew my mind. I might cover the case later on just because I found it really blew my mind again. And there is a psychology behind it that's worth exploring. So yeah, I guess a number of cases have really surprised me to the great lengths that people will go who become involved in these scams.
Yeah.
You know, it was, I think, Mary's addiction to this. She couldn't meet Brian. Her identity would be blown, right? But she loved the idea of it. They create a false world. And I think canceling also, you cancel on them, you can't meet, and you don't want to let the fantasy end. Now, unfortunately, the escape Mary and Thomas sought placed them both in a reality that was far worse than learning to deal with and cope with loneliness or boredom in their real lives.
Yeah, I would agree. And I just want to share a tip that I learned recently. I told you I've been going with my daughter, Jordan. There's this program where they teach kids internet safety, drugs, stuff like that. She's going into middle school next year. And one of the tips they gave about, the lady was telling us stories about people being catfished. And this one student locally, a 16-year-old boy, was being catfished. The police showed up at his house one day. They said, oh, the girl you're talking to online is actually a 55-year-old pedophile. And, they had traced him. So these things happen. So she was saying a good rule of thumb, because people do meet people online and it's okay. It's a way to meet people.
Right.
But you should always ask people to FaceTime.
Absolutely.
And if they're quick to say, I don't have good internet or my camera's broken, red flag, red flag. So I thought that was good advice.
I think that's a great tip. And it's a simple tip, right?
We have AI, but I'm not sure. I'm sure someone's figured it out, but it's probably very difficult to fake a real-time call.
Yes, it's hard for sure. In the end here, also, again, there's no law against catfishing. Now, catfishing is often used to facilitate many other criminal acts, like I said, which are punishable by law. So fraud, identity theft, cyberbullying, harassment, sexual online offending. But the act of pretending to be someone else online is not in itself considered illegal, which means that people like Mary Shieler are free to go. But one of the things you referenced earlier was that it's the informal sanctions that have to work in some of these cases to punish, right? And in some of these cases, informal sanctions are more serious than what the criminal justice system could offer anyway. So, Amy, after this case came to light, Mary lost her home, her family, her reputation, and she's now known as one of the most infamous catfishers to date in the United States. I mean, while that's not punishment enough for what was taken, it will have to suffice for now.
It's better than nothing.
It certainly is. I'm sure she's paying the price as well. For anyone else who is interested in watching, there is a documentary called TallHotBlonde and a Lifetime movie with the same name depicting these true events, if you'd like to look at further information.
Thank you, Meghan. So interesting.
I know. And I had you too for a little bit. You thought you knew, then you didn't. It was kind of, this is one of those cases, right? The turns and the twists.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you to listeners and viewers for joining us. And we'll catch you next time on Women in Crime. Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonso. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime. Sources for today's episode include the documentary TallHotBlonde, ABC News, the Lockport Journal, and the New York Times.